I was 23 when I drove to my parents' house that Thursday afternoon, thinking we'd finally put the tension behind us. I pictured us sitting at the kitchen table where I'd done my homework as a child, hashing out whatever words had built a wall between us. The autumn air was sharp when I stepped onto the porch, and I told myself the cold I felt was just the weather, not the moment waiting on the other side of the door. Harriet opened it first. She stood in the frame as if her hand was the only thing keeping the house upright. Vincent appeared a step behind her, his arms crossed. Neither of them smiled. I tried anyway. "I thought we could talk," I said, forcing a brightness I didn't feel. Harriet's eyes flicked over my face. Unreadable. Marceline. "It's better if you don't come here anymore." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. "What do you mean?" Vincent answered, his voice flat. "You're not welcome here. Not now. Not again. You need to learn to live on your own." It landed like a command, not advice. I stood frozen, the familiar hallway just beyond their shoulders, the smell of polished wood seeping out toward me. I wanted to step inside, to insist this was still my home. But Harriet's hand tightened on the door. "You'll figure it out," she added, almost gently, as though exile could be softened. The words hollowed me out. I was 23, still piecing together who I was supposed to be, and suddenly the two people who had always defined home were shutting me out of it. They didn't slam the door. They just closed it, steady and final, until the only sound left was the faint click of the lock sliding into place. I stood on the porch a moment longer, my breath clouding in the November air, before walking back to my car. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my hands as I started the engine, already wondering how I was supposed to build a life from nothing. The apartment I found was wedged above a strip of shops, the kind of place most people passed without noticing. The rent was low, which was all that mattered. The carpet was worn thin in the hallway, the walls stained with the ghosts of tenants before me, and at night the neon diner sign across the alley buzzed through my one small window. Still, it was mine. I carried in 2 boxes and a sewing machine that had once been a side hobby. Now it was my only anchor. I set it up on the rickety kitchen table and stared at it as though it could tell me what came next. My first jobs were scraps hemming a neighbor's trousers, patching a jacket sleeve. The payments were crumpled bills, coins pressed into my palm. But I held on to them like treasure. I cut corners wherever I could. I stopped buying coffee, cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror, learned to stretch a single bag of groceries through the week. Every coin I didn't spend went into an old glass jar I tucked into the back of the closet. At first, it was pathetic, just loose change rattling against glass, but it gave me something solid to measure against the emptiness I felt everywhere else. Nights were the hardest. I would sit on the edge of the bed, scrolling through old text messages from my mother. Most of them were ordinary reminders, small updates, even jokes, but now they read like relics from a language I no longer spoke. I searched for warmth between the lines, something that would tell me this exile was temporary, but the silence on my phone made it clear I wasn't going back. So I worked, stitched, saved, and reminded myself that survival had to be enough for now. What I didn't know then was that the jar would become more than coins. It would become proof I could create something lasting, even without the people who told me I couldn't. The jar in the back of my closet became my quiet secret. At first, it held only nickels and dimes, but over time, the weight of it grew. Every job I took on curtains for a neighbor's new apartment, repairing a winter coat for a coworker, sewing a child's Halloween costume ended with coins or bills folded into my hand. Each one went straight into the jar. It wasn't much, not enough for anyone else to notice, but for me, it was proof that forward motion was possible. Word spread slowly. A friend of a friend needed a bridesmaid dress altered. A man from down the block wanted custom drapes for his living room. With every stitch, I felt less like I was treading water and more like I was building something tangible. The hum of the machine at night filled the silence that used to echo through my apartment, and for the first time since being shut out, I began to believe I might carve a life without my parents' approval. Still, the wound wasn't gone. One Saturday morning at the farmer's market, I saw them across the street. Harriet carried a tote bag of fresh produce. Vincent walked beside her, and they looked unchanged, as if the years had passed without consequence. I froze, half expecting them to glance my way, to at least acknowledge I existed. They didn't. Their eyes slid past me as though I was a stranger. I stood there clutching a bag of fabric scraps I'd bartered for, heat rising in my chest. I wanted to call out, to prove I was still here, still standing. Instead, I turned back toward my apartment, the jar waiting in the closet like a silent reminder. Every coin I dropped in that glass didn't just mark survival. It marked distance. Each small clink was a boundary I was learning to set, a way of saying to myself they may never see me, but I see what I'm building. And the day came when the jar was heavy enough to make me wonder what might come next. By the time I turned 25, the jar in my closet had grown too heavy to lift without both hands. I emptied it one night, spreading the coins and bills across the floor in neat stacks. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was enough for a down payment on something I could call mine. The house I found sat on the edge of town, its siding chipped and the yard overgrown with weeds. Most people saw a burden. I saw a beginning. Signing the papers felt surreal. No cosigner. No family safety net. Just my name alone. When I walked into the empty living room, the air smelled of dust and neglect, but beneath it I could sense possibility. Friends shook their heads when I told them. "It's a money pit," one said. "You'll regret it." But regret was what I already lived with. I needed something that belonged to me, even if it came with broken floorboards and peeling paint. I started with the smallest things. A fresh coat of paint in the kitchen, curtains I sewed myself, roses planted by the front steps, their roots gripping the soil I turned with blistered hands. Every improvement was slow, often done late at night after finishing sewing jobs to keep up with bills. But each change stitched the house a little closer to being mine. There were moments I nearly gave in to doubt, when the plumbing failed, when I pulled back old carpet to find warped wood beneath. I wondered if I'd taken on more than I could manage, but each problem I solved gave me back a piece of the confidence I thought I'd lost. Months passed, and the house began to reflect not just effort, but resilience. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness, they carried the sound of my sewing machine, the radio playing softly as I worked, the hum of a life being built from nothing. I would sometimes pause in the doorway, looking out at the roses beginning to bloom, and think this is what survival has turned into. Not just making it through the day, but creating a place where no one can tell me I don't belong. And it was in that moment of fragile triumph that the phone call I never expected finally came. 5 years passed before their voices found their way back into my life. I was in the garden that afternoon, kneeling in the dirt with my hands covered in soil, pressing bulbs into the earth. The roses I had planted by the steps were taller now, their buds swelling with color. That was when my phone lit up on the porch rail. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Mom. For a moment, I just stared, half convinced it was a mistake. My thumb hovered before I finally swiped to answer. "Hello?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Marceline," Harriet said, her tone unusually soft, almost syrupy. "It's been so long. How have you been?" Behind her words, I caught the faint murmur of my father, like he was feeding her lines. I brushed dirt from my palms onto my jeans. "I've been fine," I answered carefully. She hesitated before continuing. "Your father and I have had a difficult stretch. His hours were cut back, and the mortgage." She trailed off with a sigh, then added, "We've been talking, and thought maybe we could stay with you for a while, just until we get back on our feet." The air seemed to thicken around me. I stood, staring at the roses I had nursed from bare sticks into life. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to believe this was a step toward reconciliation, the part of me that still replayed old text messages late at night. But another part remembered the door closing, the finality in my father's voice when he told me I wasn't welcome. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. "That's unexpected," I said slowly. Harriet rushed to fill the silence. It would be temporary, of course. We'd contribute to the bills. Families should be there for each other. Her words landed with a weight that felt familiar, like a key turning in a lock I didn't ask for. I agreed to think about it, though my gut was already tight with unease. We ended the call politely, almost warmly, but as I set the phone down, my hands trembled in the quiet. That night I couldn't sleep, because beneath the sweetness of her tone, I heard something else entirely: desperation, and I needed to know what it was hiding. The night after the call, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone, replaying every word. Part of me wanted to believe my parents simply needed help, that maybe this was the universe's way of mending what had been broken. But the unease in my stomach wouldn't let me rest. Their voices had been too polished, too careful. The next morning, I dialed Diane. She'd been a steady presence through my hardest years, a friend who didn't ask for more than I could give. When I explained, her response was calm but firm. "Let me look into it, just in case." 2 days later, I sat across from her in her office, the smell of burnt coffee lingering between stacks of paper. She slid a thin folder across the desk. "You should see this." Inside were copies of court filings, 2 eviction notices filed within the past year, credit card debt stretching past limits, small claims from neighbors and acquaintances who had lent money and never seen it back. My throat tightened as I scanned the pages. But what stopped me cold was the last sheet a credit application. My father's neat handwriting filled the boxes, and in the space-marked reference, my own name appeared. I never agreed to this. I whispered. "I know," Diane said gently, "but he used you to look stable. It's a pattern. Marceline. They're drowning, and they're reaching for anything that floats." I closed the folder slowly, my hands trembling against the cardboard edges. A part of me wanted to believe desperation had driven them to it, that fear had twisted them into people I barely recognized, but the larger part knew better. This wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't even about family. It was about convenience. I walked out of Diane's office clutching the folder, the papers inside rattling like evidence for a trial that hadn't yet begun. And by the time I reached my car, I knew I had to see just how far they were willing to go. I waited 2 days before calling, long enough for my nerves to settle, long enough to rehearse the words. The folder from Diane sat open on the table beside me, its pages like silent witnesses. When Harriet answered, her voice was bright, almost relieved. "Marceline, I was hoping to hear from you," she said. I forced a tremor into my tone. "I wish I had better news. The repairs on the house cost more than I planned, and a client backed out on a big order. Honestly, I don't know how I'll cover the bills this month. If things get worse, I might even have to sell." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Then Harriet's voice changed. "The syrup gone. Oh, well, maybe us moving in isn't the best idea right now. We wouldn't want to add to your stress." I waited, hoping for some hint of comfort, some suggestion that my well-being mattered beyond what I could provide. None came. Instead, my father's voice cut in, firm and unsympathetic. "We can't attach ourselves to instability. We've got our own issues to manage." The words sank like stones. I swallowed hard, letting them echo before answering softly. "I understand." Harriet rushed to soften the edges. "It's just bad timing, dear. Maybe later, when things are steadier." But steadier meant useful. I could hear it as clearly as if she'd said the word. Their interest in me wasn't rooted in love or reconciliation. It was rooted in what I could offer, the stability they lacked. We ended the call politely, Harriet adding a quick love you that rang hollow in my ear. I stared at the phone after hanging up, the screen already dark, and felt something inside me settle into clarity. They hadn't come back for me. They had come back for what I had built, and if they thought I would hand it over so easily, they were about to learn how wrong they were. They came on a Sunday afternoon without calling first. I saw their car pull into the driveway, the sight of it tugging at old memories I had tried to bury. By the time I opened the door, Harriet was already smiling too brightly, Vincent standing just behind her with a folder tucked under his arm. "We've been thinking things through," Harriet began, her tone warm but rehearsed. "This arrangement could work for all of us. We move in, help with the upkeep, and then together we put the house on the market. Prices are excellent right now. You'd get cash in hand. We'd get a fresh start. Everyone benefits." Vincent stepped forward, his eyes sweeping past me into the hallway as if measuring what would soon be his. "It's the practical choice," he added. I held their gaze, steady and quiet, before stepping aside just enough to reach for the folder waiting on my entry table. Without a word, I placed it between us and flipped it open. Eviction filings, debt notices, the credit application with my name scribbled as a reference. Harriet's smile faltered. Vincent's jaw tightened. "I know," I said calmly. "I know exactly why you're here. And it isn't because you miss me." Vincent bristled. "You've been digging into our lives. I looked for the truth," I replied evenly. "Because you stopped offering it." Harriet tried a softer key. "We just want to start over, to be close again." I shook my head. "No, this house isn't your escape. It's my life. I built it inch by inch, and I won't sell my piece to cover your mistakes." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind moving through the roses outside. Finally, I stepped back into the doorway and let my hand rest against the frame. "If you want help finding resources, I'll send you a list. But if you want my house, the answer is no." I closed the door firmly, the echo reminding me of another door closed years before, but this time it was mine to shut. When the latch clicked, I leaned my forehead against the door and let the silence sink in. For a moment, the house felt too still, as if the air itself was waiting for me to decide what came next. My chest ached, not with the sharp sting of rejection I'd once known, but with something heavier, a grief for all the years I had wasted trying to earn what was never going to be given. Tears came then, sudden and hot. They weren't for Harriet or Vincent, not anymore. They were for the younger version of me who had stood outside their house 5 years ago, believing her worth could be erased with a single closed door. I cried for the time lost to doubt, for the nights spent scrolling through old messages, hoping silence might break into forgiveness. When the tears finally slowed, I wiped my face with the heel of my hand and drew in a steady breath. Then I reached for the lock, sliding it firmly into place. This time, the sound was not rejection, it was protection. I stepped into the kitchen and filled a small watering can, carrying it out to the garden. The roses by the steps were catching the last light of the afternoon, their petals unfurling in shades of pink and red. I poured water gently over their roots, watching it soak into the soil I had turned with my own hands. The quiet that settled around me was not empty. It was full, grounding, certain. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on my shoulders felt lighter. I straightened, the can dangling loosely from my hand, and looked at the house behind me. It no longer felt fragile. It felt like mine. 5 years ago, I drove away from my parents' house with nothing but my car keys and a pit in my stomach. I was 23, directionless, and convinced that being cast out meant I had failed. Now, at 28, I walk through the rooms of my own home and feel a steadiness that no one can take from me. The silence I once feared has become a kind of companion. It wraps around me when I wake in the mornings and follows me as I work late into the night, steady as the hum of my sewing machine. This house, with its patched walls and creaking floors, carries my fingerprints in every corner. It may not be perfect, but it is proof that I could begin again without them. Proof that survival can turn into something stronger. I sometimes imagine what I would do if they knocked again. If they came not with plans or demands, but with honesty. I know I could stand in the doorway and listen. But until that day comes, the lock will hold. Not out of spite, but out of respect for myself, for the life I've built, for the boundaries that keep me whole. Outside, the roses are in full bloom, their petals catching the late sun. I remember planting them as bare sticks, wondering if they would ever take root. They did, on their own time, without permission, without approval. So did I. I kneel to pull a weed from the soil, brushing dirt from my hands, and rise to face the house that carries my name alone. The past no longer feels like a weight. It feels like distance, and I have no desire to walk back across it.